Once I got upstairs, I heard her screaming, struggling. Leave me go, get off me. We picked Halloween night. It was only supposed to be a prank.
Oil City in Pennsylvania is a tight-knit town that is steeped in the history of America's oil boom. Nestled along the Allegheny River, it once served as the heart of the burgeoning oil industry. The discovery of oil at nearby Drake Well in 1859 transformed the sleepy rural area into a bustling centre of commerce and industry. Then by the late 19th century, Oil City was booming, with refineries, oil storage facilities, and a growing population of workers and entrepreneurs hoping to cash in on the newfound resource. The wealth and prosperity brought by oil led to rapid expansion, but as the decades passed and oil production moved elsewhere, the town's fortunes waned. Today, Oil City is a quieter place, its former glory preserved in its historic downtown buildings and the memories of those who lived through the boom. Although it's no longer an industrial hub, the town retains its small-town charm, with a close-knit community. Halloween in Oil City has always been a time of excitement, but that all changed in the 90s. In 1992, the air was crisp and filled with anticipation as the holiday drew close. Houses were adorned with spooky decorations. Plastic skeletons rattled in the breeze, jack-o'-lanterns flickered with candlelight, and paper ghosts swayed from porches. Children looked forward to trick-or-treating on the weekend, eagerly planning their costumes as they walked past homes decorated with fake cobwebs and gravestones scattered across the front lawn. It was just after 8 p.m. on the 27th of October as Dan Payton walked along West 1st Street. Ahead of him, he noticed a man walking towards the intersection. Tall and shadowy, his dark clothing blending into the dim light. Across the street, a little girl was heading in the same direction. Dan watched absently as they neared the corner, their paths about to meet. As they reached the intersection at the same time, something in the man's stance shifted. He looked at the little girl, and in a flash, he lunged and grabbed her. Shauna Howe was buzzing with excitement as Halloween of 1992 neared. The 11-year-old girl lived on West 1st Street in Oil City, along with her mother Lucy and two of her siblings. Lucy and Shauna's father Robert had been separated for some time now, and he lived over in Tidioute with Shauna's third sibling. Halloween had always been Shauna's favourite time of the year. The dressing up, the crisp autumn air, the promise of candy and spooky stories. This year, her anticipation was even greater, as the Girl Scouts were hosting a special Halloween party on the 27th of October. The event was all she could talk about in the days leading up to it. That evening after dinner, Shauna pulled on her outfit, a pink and green shirt paired with black striped pants. Her mother Lucy smiled as Shauna kissed her goodbye at the front door. "Be safe," Lucy called after her, watching her daughter head off to the first free Methodist church on Wilson Avenue. The church was less than a mile away, a quick 10-minute walk that Shauna had made countless times. When she arrived at the church, her friends greeted her, and together they launched into the festivities. They sang songs, played games, and soaked up the spirit of Halloween. As the evening drew to a close around 8 p.m, the party wound down. Shauna asked her friend Joelle Sines if she could walk her back home because she was afraid of the dark. Joelle told Shauna that she could walk home with her, and then her father would walk Shauna the rest of the way to her home. But Shauna didn't want to annoy anybody. so she said that it was okay and that she would walk home alone. By 9 p.m, Shauna still hadn't arrived back home. At first, Lucy wasn't too worried. It was a Halloween party after all, and it was probably running late. But as the minutes continued to trickle past, a knot formed in Lucy's stomach. She called around local hospitals before finally calling the police. After Shauna was reported missing, Oil City Police made contact with the National Crime Information Centre. In turn, they sent out a detailed description of Shauna to police stations across the country. Police within a 99-mile radius were immediately notified of Shauna's disappearance. Naturally, detectives made contact with Shauna's father, Robert, hoping that she was there. Robert was adamant that he didn't have his daughter, and a search of his home confirmed this. As the search continued, local media was dominated with reports on Shauna's disappearance. Her photograph was emblazoned over the local newspapers, along with a description of the missing girl. She stood at 5 feet tall, weighed 78 pounds, and had straight medium-length brown hair and blue eyes. As for identifying features, Shauna had a scar behind her right ear that extended around the entire ear, and a chickenpox scar in the middle of her forehead. Shauna had also been born with a cleft right foot, which had a tendency to turn in. She also had crooked front teeth. But by the time Shauna was reported missing, police already had a major lead. Two hours before Lucy's frantic phone call, another one had come in from a man named Dan Payden. Dan had been walking along West 1st Street in an easterly direction, just a short distance from Shauna's home. It was shortly after 8 p.m, the night that Shauna vanished. It was an ordinary evening, but what he witnessed next was anything but. As he approached the local doctor's office, about 2 blocks from where Shauna lived, Dan noticed a tall, thin man walking up Reed Street right beside the office. The man was dressed in dark clothing, and he was unkempt in appearance. At the same time, Dan saw a little girl heading west on West 1st Street. Though he could see both the man and the girl, their views were obscured from one another by a corner of the building. For a brief moment, it seemed like nothing unusual, just 2 people walking their separate paths. But as they reached the intersection, something terrible happened. The man suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the little girl. Dan froze for a split second as the girl tried to scream, her voice cut off almost immediately by the man's large hand. He muffled her cries and without hesitation lifted her into his arms. In a panic, Dan began running after them, his heart pounding as the man turned and fled down Reed Street, carrying the little girl with him. But by the time Dan reached Reed Street, the man had already made his escape. A dark red car, partially hidden behind some bushes and facing West Front Street, had been waiting. The vehicle sped off. Dan didn't see the man or the little girl. He just saw the vehicle speeding off and put 2 and 2 together. The situation had unfolded so quickly that it was all a blur. The man had vanished, and so had the girl and the car. Dan could only recall a few details. He heard a scream. The car was dull, dark red in colour, and it seemed to have Pennsylvania plates, although he couldn't catch the number. I never saw her forced into the car, Dan later told detectives. I heard her scream, but as far as seeing him actually put her in the car, I didn't see that, he said. Still, Dan did the only thing that he could. He called the police. Within 15 to 20 minutes, officers had arrived on the scene. But by then, the man and the little girl were long gone. The detectives were now operating on the theory that this little girl was Shauna and that she had been abducted. The small, tight-knit community of Oil City had banded together, volunteering in droves to assist in the frantic search. FBI spokesman Tom Noshi said, "We're developing a number of leads. We're following as many leads as we can. We're trying to develop as many witnesses as we can." Detectives were canvassing the neighbourhood where the potential abduction took place. They wanted to speak to every single possible witness, hoping that somebody may have seen something out of the ordinary that night. Maybe somebody else had witnessed the abduction as well and could provide a description of the driver and vehicle. While detectives focused on the ground in Oil City, Shauna's family took matters into their own hands. Keith Sybil, her uncle, had ventured to a hiking trail near the highway, about 8 miles south of the town. The spot, which was known as Coulter's Landing, was an area he and Shauna had visited before. It was peaceful, nestled in the woods of Rockland Township, favoured by locals for its scenic views and isolation. As he trudged along the trail, his eyes scoured the ground, searching for any clue, any small trace that might lead him to his niece. He was stopped in his tracks when he spotted something on the ground. A green leotard. It looked familiar. Keith knelt down, brushing the dirt off the fabric. The leotard was torn, slightly muddy, but unmistakable. Shauna owned one just like it. Clutching it in his hand, he hurried back to his sister Lucy. When Lucy saw the leotard, her face drained of colour. It was the same one that Shauna had worn underneath her clothing the night she disappeared. Coulter's Landing immediately became a grim lead in Shauna's disappearance. It was secluded, far from prying eyes, a perfect location for somebody who wanted to stay hidden. It certainly wasn't the kind of place a child should be with a stranger. Following the discovery, detectives redirected their focus to the area. It wouldn't be long before what happened to Shauna became all too apparent. Halloween dawned cold and grey on Saturday morning, but the eerie atmosphere had nothing to do with the holiday. While families were preparing for an evening of trick-or-treating, detectives and volunteers combed the rugged landscape of Coulter's Landing in search of Shauna. They moved slowly, calling out her name into the still morning air. The weather mirrored the mood, dreary and oppressive, with low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down on everyone involved. It was just before 9 a.m. when the search party made its way towards East Sandy Creek, a tributary that snaked its way through the heart of Coulter's Landing, cutting through the dense woodland. The thick canopy of trees stretched on for miles. They reached an abandoned railroad bridge, which the creek ran under, and as they neared the murky water, something caught the attention of one of the searchers. It was a flash of pale colour amid the dark rocks and fallen logs. People rushed over, navigating the slippery banks as their worst fears seemed to materialise right before their very eyes. There, lodged between a rock and a log, was the lifeless body of a child. It was Shauna. The little girl's body lay face down in the creek, her hair drifting gently in the cold water. She looked eerily peaceful, her face devoid of the terror or pain they had feared. There were no gunshot wounds, no stab marks, nothing to suggest a violent struggle at first glance. It was as though she had simply fallen asleep in the water. But the reality was undeniable. Shauna was dead, and somebody had killed her and dumped her body there. Shauna was dead, and somebody had killed her and dumped her body here. The area was rugged and desolate, not the kind of place for someone, especially a little child, to come to their life's end. One of the detectives quickly radioed for backup, calling in the forensic team while the others worked carefully to retrieve Shauna's body from the water. Two of Shauna's uncles, who had been part of the search, watched as the little girl was gently lifted from the water. Their faces crumbled as they confirmed what no one wanted to admit. It was definitely her. Over at the medical examiner's office, it was discovered that Shauna had died of blunt force trauma to the head and chest. But it wasn't believed that Shauna had been beaten to death. Instead, she had been thrown over the railroad trestle and had fallen 30 feet to her death. Detectives working on the case had a terrifying theory: that Shauna had been held captive. They had searched the area where her body was found just the day beforehand, but Shauna wasn't there. The grisly discovery sent shockwaves through not only the close-knit community of Oil City, but across the entire nation. The realisation that a child killer could be lurking among them sparked a deep fear, especially among parents. Halloween, which was typically a time of celebration and excitement for the town's children, had been transformed into a night filled with dread. In response to the tragedy, authorities cancelled the usual trick-or-treating festivities after dark. Instead, parents were told that their children could go door to door, but only in daylight hours. Even then, the atmosphere was tense. As children went from house to house, dressed in costumes that now felt out of place, a police helicopter hovered overhead. Police Sergeant Ron DeBerti summed up the town's anxiety, stating, "The community's in panic, and rightfully so." After Halloween passed, the streets of Oil City became desolate. Parents who were terrified of letting their children walk alone drove them to and from school, their eyes scanning every shadow. Trudy Alex, a local parent, expressed the fear that gripped the town, stating, "I think it's terrible. It scared me to think that something can happen in a small town like Oil City. My daughter was afraid to go trick-or-treating in daylight hours. It scares her." Oil City manager Tom Tokovich spoke about the collective fear that had settled in. He said, The concern is there among everybody. Not knowing the circumstances of the possible abduction, and the fact there's somebody out there that may be of the frame of mind, makes parents fearful about their children going out at night, even escorted. Some parents even began arming their children with hairspray, a low-tech substitute for mace. Tensions escalated even further when graffiti began appearing near schools, warning elementary students that they could be next. The chilling messages exacerbated the already heightened fear, leaving parents desperate for answers and safety measures. In response, the community banded together to form a child safety group called Operation Kid Watch. Determined to protect their children, parents took proactive steps, working closely with local law enforcement to prevent another tragedy. Detectives involved in the case provided their own safety tips. Sheriff Gene Price advised that young girls should travel in groups of 3 or more, and parents were encouraged to stay vigilant, requiring phone calls from their children when they reached their destination. Despite the precautions, the lingering unease in Oil City remained, an undercurrent of fear that no safety measure could completely erase. Oil City wasn't immune to murder at the time either. In the past 15 months, 2 women and a baby had been killed, but the arrests were made quickly. In Shauna's case, however, the days continued to drag by with no developments. People began to wonder whether Shauna's killer would ever be found. The investigation into Shauna's murder was ramped up as detectives conducted door-to-door interviews with those who lived near Coulter's Hole. Nobody could offer any insight into Shauna's murder. Nobody had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. So they turned their attention once more to the kidnapping that had been witnessed. Detectives announced that they believed the vehicle in question was an early 1980s Oldsmobile Omega that was painted with dull red primer. They asked that if anybody knew anything about a similar vehicle to reach out immediately. The weeks continued to drag by, and detectives seemed no closer to catching Shauna's killer than on day one of the investigation. Towards the end of November, Indiana Borough Mayor J.D. Varner offered to send a borough detective to Oil City to offer their assistance, but this offer was turned down. A reward of $5,000 was established by the Oil City Council, but it did very little to entice people to come forward. Christmas came and went, but the typical joy of the season never reached Shauna's family. On Christmas Eve, they tried to hold on to fragments of tradition, but it just wasn't the same. The description of the vehicle used in the abduction had seemed to hit a dead end, and the family feared that Shauna would never receive justice. The new year brought a new investigative tactic, as detectives began looking into the possibility that Shauna's murder was connected to the rape of a 12-year-old girl in Ohio. That weekend, the girl in Ohio reported that a man had grabbed her near her home in Warren and had sexually assaulted her. He snarled that he would kill her if necessary, and that he had killed before. The man also choked the girl. The little girl's description of the man was similar to the description of the man who had abducted Shauna. It also matched the description of a man who had pulled a 19-year-old woman into an alley and tried to sexually assault her before the 12-year-old girl was attacked. While detectives had their suspicions, they couldn't either confirm nor deny that the cases were linked. Weeks gradually turned into months, and Shauna's murder remained unsolved. The small town of Oil City was now truly gripped by an unshakable fear. It was the kind of horror that people expected to hear about in big cities, not in their own close-knit community, where everybody knew each other by name. The streets, which were once filled with the chatter of children and the hum of everyday life, remained eerily silent. The playgrounds that echoed with laughter were now empty, with their swings swaying in the wind, as if waiting for the children who no longer came. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter, and conversations at dinner tables were haunted by the same unspoken dread. Would their family be next? Elementary schools transformed into fortresses where doors were locked throughout the day. Nobody took chances anymore. Children who once walked to school now arrived in cars, hurried out by parents who scanned the streets for anything unusual. The curfew of the night descended earlier, as fear spread through every home. In the wake of Shauna's disappearance and death, an unexpected trend took hold in the town: self-defense classes. Attendance surged, not just among adults, but even more so among children. It wasn't just the parents who were afraid. Kids too were learning to be vigilant. The classes filled up fast, young hands learning to block, strike and scream in ways they never thought they'd need to. The carefree innocence of youth had been replaced by a cautious awareness that something terrible had happened, and could happen again. "Everybody's scared," said Jane Fogarty, a long-time waitress on the town's south side. The diner was quieter these days, much like the rest of the town. She'd seen people change in the months since Shauna's murder, eyes darting to every new face. In the absence of answers, rumours began to swell. John Spence commented, "People can't help but think it's someone acquainted or who knew the family." He then added, they hope they're wrong. The weeks stretched into months and then eventually into years. Shauna's murder became a painful memory that still lingered heavily over Oil City. Despite countless interviews and every lead chased, the case went cold. The police had set up telephone lines and even a post box to encourage tips from the public, but nothing of substance ever came. It seemed like no one could offer the piece of information that would crack the case wide open. The unsolved murder transformed Oil City in ways that no one could have predicted. Once a town where Halloween was a beloved tradition, the city council had voted to ban nighttime trick-or-treating. Year after year, parents kept their children indoors. A curfew of fear replaced the joy that Halloween once held. Streets that were once bustling with kids on Halloween night became disturbingly still. Robert Moyer, the acting chief of police, reflected on the deep changes that had come to the town. Once you're exposed to something like that up here, it really gets you thinking about safety issues that you didn't have to worry about in the past, he said. The town was now forever shadowed by the horror of Shauna's murder. It left people on edge, cautious in a way they hadn't been before. By April of 1994, the detectives began working on a new angle. They turned to the National Centre for the Analysis of Violent Crime, seeking their help in constructing a profile of Shauna's killer. Their findings pointed in a disturbing direction. There was a good chance that Shauna's killer was somebody familiar with her and her family. Even more chilling, detectives believed the killer was still in the area, living among them. The psychological profile suggested that the killer had likely struggled with relationships or finance, perhaps lost a job or someone close to them. There might have been signs, an illness or a sudden change in behaviour, like increased drug or alcohol use. The detectives feared that the stress of the murder could drive the person to strike again, and they pleaded with the community for information. But the tips that came in were few and far between. Each one was diligently followed up, every lead traced, yet none brought the closure they so desperately sought. The case once more fell from local newspapers, and in 1996 detectives pleaded once more for information. They reiterated their belief that Shauna's killer was a local and may have been living in the area. Lieutenant Irby Conley announced, "I can assure you that this case is not closed, and will not be until it's resolved." In September of 1999, there was a noticeable police presence at a yellow brick house near where Shauna was abducted. Detectives could be seen searching the home and removing several items as evidence. The home had previously been rented by a Connecticut prison inmate at the time of Shauna's murder. His name was Michael Kuzwick, and he said to reporters that he had been repeatedly questioned as a suspect. He stated, "Well, God rest her soul, and with all due respect for the Howe family, her death has been a misery for me." Detectives had zoned in on Michael as a person of interest very early on in the case, and he had been interrogated, had his blood taken, and had been given polygraph examinations. But Michael was serving time for forgery and drug possession. Not really crimes that would lead to child abduction and murder. The search of the home came up empty, and Michael Kuzwick was quietly forgotten about by detectives. Another person of interest that emerged over the years was Richard Jacobs, a Westmoreland County man who was convicted along with his wife of sexually abusing nurses they had hired to care for their sick children. The Jacobs had lived in Franklin when Shauna was abducted, and Richard's wife, Diane, admitted to police that she lied about her husband's alibi on the night she disappeared. But again, detectives could never find any evidence to connect them with Shauna's murder. They were unaware of it at the time, but their hard work was eventually going to pay off. At the scene where Shauna's body had been found, detectives had discovered a critical piece of evidence: DNA. But this DNA was initially missed. Hair found on Shauna's leotard had come from her, while fibres on the railroad trestle had come from her shirt. There were 3 small stains on the back of the leotard that remained a mystery for years. But with the advancement of DNA technology and forensic science, it was later revealed that these stains were semen. It was a devastating clue, one that made the grim reality all too clear. Shauna hadn't just been murdered, she'd been sexually assaulted as well. For years, detectives remained tight-lipped about this discovery. But behind the scenes, this DNA had become the cornerstone of the investigation. As the technology of forensic science advanced, the sample was routinely run through the national database. Each time, detectives hoped it would lead them to the killer. Every field search only deepened the frustration, but they continued to hold on to hope that one day that match would come. That day finally arrived in March of 2002, almost a decade after Shauna's murder. When detectives once again ran the DNA through the national database, the result came back with a hit. A match to a 30-year-old man named James O'Brien. James was serving a 4.5 to 20-year sentence at the State Correctional Institution for kidnapping a woman back in 1995. As part of his recent conviction, his DNA had been taken and entered into the national database. From behind bars, James O'Brien vehemently denied any involvement in Shauna's murder. In an interview with a reporter from the Derrick newspaper, he said, "I didn't do it, so I wasn't going to admit it. I have a clear conscience." He went further, accusing detectives of leaking the DNA evidence to the media in a desperate attempt to close the case. Despite James's protests of innocence, the DNA evidence spoke for itself. It seemed like the breakthrough detectives had been waiting for, but even with this development, the case didn't move swiftly. And the years continued to crawl by without resolution. The match provided a glimmer of hope, but it wasn't the closure Shauna's family and the town had longed for. Then in July of 2004, another bombshell dropped. It was announced that not only James O'Brien, but also his brother, Timothy O'Brien, had been charged with Shauna's murder. Timothy was also in prison, serving a 33-month to 5-year sentence for assaulting a little boy and girl. The brothers were charged with first and second-degree murder, rape, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, and kidnapping. But that wasn't all. Just the day after the charges were handed down, it was announced that the third man had been arrested and charged with murder and kidnap. This third man was identified as 45-year-old Eldred Ted Walker. After James was connected to the murder with DNA, the eyewitness to the abduction saw an interview with Walker. He was sure that he was the man he had seen kidnapping Shauna from the street. He was brought in for questioning, and he made a startling confession.
How is it did you first learned of Shauna Howe's abduction?
Tim and Jim O'Brien came and told me. They just came running in telling me that their little girl was kidnapped downtown.
When pressed for more information, Walker broke down and said that he and the O'Briens had spoken about grabbing someone off the street just days before Shauna was abducted. He said that the brothers had wanted to abduct a child and release her a short time later. It was a prank, he said, to irritate Oil City police. He admitted that he was the one to grab Shauna from the street and said that he knew her to see.
Well, I grab a hold of her and take her back.
Did you grab her?
I grab her around the shoulders.
You grab her,
Carry down and hand her to Tim.
you hand her to Tim.
He then ran with her to the car where James and Timothy were waiting, and they sped off with Shauna in the back seat while he returned home. Shortly thereafter, the brothers appeared at his home with Shauna.
They come in carrying Shauna. And going up the steps.
They took her upstairs.
Once they got upstairs, I heard her screaming, struggling. Leave me go, get off me. We picked Halloween night. It was only supposed to be a prank.
Walker said that he left the house, and when he returned, the brothers and Shauna were gone. However, after Walker was arrested and charged, he denied any involvement in the murder and said that his confession had been coerced. He stated, "I've never seen Shauna Howe in my whole life. As God is my witness, I had nothing to do with this." In August, James, Timothy and Walker were ordered to stand trial for the murder of Shauna. Walker subsequently tried to get his second-degree murder charge dismissed. His defense attorney argued that the evidence didn't show he was connected to the murder. Instead, he said it showed that he had helped kidnap Shauna as part of a prank, and that he believed she would be released. The judge refused, but he did agree that an outside jury would hear the case. The defence teams had argued that it would have been possible to find an impartial jury because of the publicity the case had generated over the years. Then in June the next year, Timothy requested that his trial be separate from his brother and Walker. The other two defendants followed suit and requested that they too stand trial separately. It was up to the judge, but under the law, if one defendant made a statement implicating another, he can't be forced to take the stand to be cross-examined without violating his right against self-incrimination. The judge ultimately ruled that Walker could be tried separate to the brothers. Judge William White said that Walker wouldn't have been able to present certain evidence if he were tried with the O'Briens. In his ruling, he wrote, "Clearly, Walker's defence theory rests on the concept that he didn't participate in the murder of the victim. He alleges that he withdrew from the criminal activity shortly after the defendant grabbed the victim on the street." Elder Ted Walker appeared in court on the 14th of September 2005, where it was announced that he had reached a plea agreement with the prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of third-degree murder and kidnapping, and agreed to testify against the O'Brien brothers. In court, he admitted that he was the man who had grabbed Shauna off the street corner as she walked home from the Girl Scout Halloween party. He said that the O'Brien brothers were waiting in their car around the corner, and that he had bundled her into the car before heading to his own home in another car that was nearby. Shortly thereafter, James and Timothy arrived at his home with Shauna, where they took her upstairs, he said. Walker testified, "I heard her yelling and screaming. She yelled, 'Let me go, get off me,' stuff like that." Walker told the courtroom that he asked the O'Briens to stop and leave his home. They told him to keep quiet and to worry about his own son. Walker said he then left the home, and when he returned, the brothers and Shauna were gone, and he assumed that she had been released. He once more claimed he believed that Shauna had been abducted as part of a prank to make the Oil City Police Department look foolish. After the guilty plea, Shauna's mother, Lucy, said that she held Walker just as responsible as the O'Brien brothers. She then added, "On the other hand, he is testifying against the others, so he is trying." The murder trial for James and Timothy O'Brien opened on the 11th of October 2005. The courtroom was crammed, which stood as a testament to the impact the case had on the community. Prosecutor Mary Vion said to the jury, "The person who knows exactly everything that happened over those 2.5 days is Shauna, and she can't be here to tell us what happened. but Shauna has indeed shown us what happened. She said that the DNA evidence in the case proved that it was the brothers who had killed Shauna. James's defence attorney, Wayne Hundermark, told the jury not to trust Walker. He stated, "Ted Walker is a murderer, a child molester. He's evil, sadistic and cruel, and the Commonwealth made a deal with the devil, and now we're going to live with it." He said that Walker knew Shauna and that there was evidence to show he had killed her. According to the defence attorney, Walker told anyone who would listen that detectives would probably find Shauna's body in the area where it was eventually found. He touched on the DNA evidence, stating, "On the DNA, pay attention during the trial. We'll explain it to you." During Timothy's defence attorney, James Goodwin's opening statements, he too kept up the strategy of attacking Walker. He stated, "Timothy O'Brien is here based on the statements of liars who told the police what they wanted to hear." Testimony then got underway with Dr. Isidore Mihalakis, a medical examiner from New Jersey who was hired to review Shauna's autopsy. He agreed that she had died from blunt force trauma. Defence Hundermark suggested that Walker had killed Shauna and then disposed of her body over the train track. But the medical examiner said the severe bruising to Shauna's neck, head and body could only have occurred if she was alive when she fell from the height. Dan Payton, the witness to the abduction, was next called as a prosecution witness. He described what he had seen and said he chased after the man and girl but wasn't quick enough. All he saw was a car speeding away from the scene. According to Dan, however, he was sure the man who lifted Shauna from the street was Walker. The jury also got to hear from Eldred Ted Walker. He said he believed that the abduction of Shauna was a prank. He testified, "I didn't want to do it, but they started calling me a chicken." Walker said that it was actually his idea to kidnap a child on Halloween, but said that he was only joking around. But 2 days after this conversation, the O'Briens brought up the idea again. He said they originally wanted to snatch a little boy that they knew, but said that Timothy then suggested they take a young girl instead. According to Walker, he bumped into the brothers on the 27th of October and said they planned on kidnapping someone that evening. They spotted Shauna walking down the street, and Walker admitted that he walked up to her and grabbed her by the shoulders after asking her about Girl Scout cookies to get her attention. Speaking in a low, raspy voice, he said he handed her over to Timothy, who shoved her in the back seat of the vehicle. Prosecutor Brad Folk asked whether he did anything to help Shauna, and he replied, "I should have done more, but no." It was revealed during the trial that Walker was actually questioned just days after Shauna's body was found. He said that he knew nothing about the murder. The defence teams capitalised on this and said that if Walker had lied about Shauna's murder back then he was most likely lying about it now. Defence attorney Hundermark challenged him, asking, "You can't remember all your lies, can you, Mr. Walker?" But he stuck to his story and said he had lied over the years because he was afraid of losing his children if he were arrested. After he stepped down, the focus of the trial shifted to the forensic evidence. FBI forensic examiner Jennifer Lutman told the jury that chances were 1 in a quadrillion that the semen found on Shauna's clothing wasn't James. In fact, semen hadn't just been found on Shauna's leotard, but in her mouth as well. According to the FBI agent Sean Van Slyke, when he set the DNA evidence in front of James, he dropped his head to his lap and didn't speak. After several moments, he said, "All right, I'm not going to sit here and deny what you already know." Testimony was then presented to connect his brother Timothy to the murder as well. A former inmate, Ryan Heath, told the jury that Timothy admitted to his role in the murder to him while they were behind bars. It was September 11th, 2001, and the jail was on lockdown because of the terrorist attacks. He testified. Timothy O'Brien told me he was the one who took Shauna out of the car and threw her over the bridge at Coulter's Hole. The defence then began their case by trying to show that it was Walker who had raped and killed Shauna. They called his sister-in-law, Fiona Walker, to the witness stand. She testified that he had given her a stained, stinking Chevy Nova to pay off a debt just days after Shauna disappeared. She said that the water she used to scrub the car turned red. Prosecutors, however, responded by presenting insurance records, a state title search, and a handwritten receipt which showed that Walker didn't even have the car until June of 1993 and didn't give it to Fiona until November of 1994. After this, the defence rested their case, paving the way for closing arguments. Defence attorney Hunter Mark once more pointed the finger at Walker, telling the jury, "This evil, in this case, was Ted Walker. He's not just a paedophile, not just a liar, he's evil." Defence attorney Goodwin said during his closing arguments the only reason his client Timothy was on trial was because he was the brother of James. He said, "There's not one single piece of physical evidence that connect Tim O'Brien to this case. You cannot convict somebody solely on being a brother." Prosecutor Vion countered this and attacked both the defence positions as smoke and mirrors. The jury returned with the verdict. They found both James and Timothy O'Brien guilty of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, kidnapping, and criminal conspiracy to commit kidnapping. However, they acquitted them of first-degree murder and rape. Nevertheless, the conviction of second-degree murder came with a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole. The two brothers remained stone-faced throughout, and Shauna's mother touched on this outside of court. She said, "How do you explain people who just got convicted of murder too and their face never changed?" Still, Lucy expressed relief, adding, "I needed this to be solved. These people will never hurt anyone again. They took a little girl's life." Following the verdict, Eldred Ted Walker filed a motion to withdraw his guilty plea. The judge ruled that he couldn't. Walker returned to court on the 26th of January 2007, where he was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. The sentence exceeded state sentencing guidelines because of Walker's lack of remorse, said the judge. In handing down the sentence, Judge Lombok said, "This crime had a devastating effect on this family and citizens of this community. It changed the way they live their lives. All this was set into motion by this defendant. He was aware of the victim's torture and he did nothing." He then added, "He still says this was a prank. This was a prank. The snatching of an 11-year-old girl was not a prank and will never be a prank." Outside of court, Lucy commented, "Shaun is gone and there's no closure to her death. But it kind of makes me feel better that I know that the ones responsible for what happened are never going to be able to do this again." In September of 2008, Oil City made a quiet yet profound decision. Trick-or-treating would finally return to nighttime hours. It had been 16 long years since children had wandered the streets at night. For over a decade, the tradition had been altered, a small but constant reminder of the unspeakable horror that had shaken the town to its core. For years, the sight of children going door to door in the daylight hours had been a concession to the fear that still lingered in the hearts of parents. But in 2008, something shifted after a local girl collected signatures and handed them to the mayor. It was decided that Halloween night would once more belong to the children. As the sun set on that first Halloween night, back in the darkness, there was a sense of quiet triumph. Streets once abandoned by dusk, now filled with laughter again. Children clutching their bags of candy as they raced from house to house under the stars. It was a bittersweet return to a tradition that had long been stolen from them, but it also marked a moment of progress. The shadows of the past would never fully disappear, but on that night, Oil City took a small, courageous step towards reclaiming the normalcy it had lost so many years before. Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to my newest supporter up on Patreon, Isabel. You can join us up on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and in exchange for your support, I upload ad-free and early release episodes, bonus episodes of Morbidology Plus, behind the scenes, and I also send out a handwritten thank you card along with some cool exclusive merch. If you didn't know, Morbidology is now up on YouTube, and the episodes are presented in a documentary style along with some videos and photos associated with the case. So just head on over to YouTube, search for Morbidology, and please do hit that subscribe button. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.